Whether you're a beginner or a veteran woodworker, the best way to improve your skills is to start small and go out of your way to try new things, which is exactly what I'm about to do. Here's 4 small projects that can be done in a day and all include things I've never tried before. So this first project is one that I've never actually done before, but I've always wanted to try, and that's to create a bowl or a large serving dish without using a lathe or any sketchy table saw tricks. I'm currently pretty full to the brim with offcuts and scraps from all my projects the last couple of years, and so there's really never been a better time to try something new. To start, I'm going to follow a couple basic rules. The first is choosing lots of variety. I'm looking for boards of all different species of wood, both tropical and domestic, as well as a variety in the thickness of the material. Anything from 1/4 of an inch all the way up to 2 inches thick is good. This is going to help me create the most visual contrast. And the other rule is that these boards need to be a minimum of 3 inches wide. That's really about the narrowest width that you can use to create an actual bowl-like vessel. And if you don't have access to all these different species in your scrap bin, just create the most variety out of what you have. I'm cutting all my selections down to that 3 inches wide mark, and you'll see why in a minute, but first I need to mill up some of these boards flat and to the same thickness because some of these are a bit warped from sitting around, or they're just still in rough sawn state and were never surfaced to begin with. Okay, now comes maybe the most important step. I need to arrange all these boards into a pattern that looks the best to me. Again, remember that I'm shooting for variety, but I do also like symmetry. So by a process of mix and match and varying both the wood species and the board thicknesses, I've come to 2 designs that I really like. And what I'm doing here is essentially creating really thick edge grain cutting boards. And that's why I wanted to make all my pieces 3 inches wide, because that's just going to make this next part much easier. First comes the glue up, and this is just like making a cutting board. Just be careful to keep everything as flat as possible, and I'm aiming for these bowl blanks to be between 14 inches and 15 inches square. So while those blanks are in the clamps drying, I thought I would create a second example because, maybe you don't have access to a wide range of those hardwoods and exotic woods in your scrap bin. So this version is just going to have a walnut panel that's glued up like a long grain cutting board, and it's going to be thicker. And then I've got a much thinner maple panel that I'm just going to glue on top like this. And I think that's going to give a lot of contrast. It's still going to look elegant and beautiful, but be a little bit easier to execute. And the other benefit to this style is that you can use smaller and cheaper clamps here to laminate these 2 boards together. Okay, once the blanks come out of the clamps, I'm going to go ahead and send them through the planer just to clean up both faces and make sure everything is the same thickness. With my blanks all ready, I need to figure out where the approximate center is. It doesn't really have to be dead center because I'm not going to be cutting all the way to the edge of these blanks. It just has to be close. Then I can drill a hole in that spot, and this is going to be for the pivot pin of my circle cutting jig. This jig from Jasper is nice because it has increments of 1/4 of an inch, which is a lot more precise than my homemade circle jig that only has increments of 1 inch. So my first cut with the router is going to be to define the outside edge of the bowl. I'm making this cut in several passes using a 1/2 inch spiral bit, and each pass I'm lowering the router about 1/4 of an inch. I put 2 strips of 2x4 on either end of the blank, and that's just to act like a buffer so that my router bit doesn't have the chance to accidentally run into any of my clamps or the bench dogs on the other side. And I just kept making these passes until I got a little bit past halfway down the side of the bowl. There's really no need to go further than that right now. And once that was done, then I just adjusted the circle jig and began cutting the inside edge of the bowl. My goal here was to make the walls of the bowl about 3/4 of an inch thick. And I just repeated that process of making shallow passes until I reached what would be the bottom of the inside of the bowl. That's going to serve as my reference point for the next part of the process, and I'm shooting for the bottom of these bowls to be about 5/8 of an inch thick. Okay, now to hog out all the material in the middle, I'm going to switch over to using my drill press with the biggest Forstner bit that I have, which was 2¼ inches. The bigger the bit that I use here, the faster that I can clean out all this wood in the middle. So I suppose you could do this process using a hand drill if you don't have a drill press, but I chose this method because it's far less tiring to use the power of the drill press, and that's going to make this go much faster as a result. And also, and probably more importantly, I can use my depth stop to make sure that each one of these plunges goes to the exact desired depth. That would be a lot harder to accomplish by hand with a drill. I did run into a situation here at the end where I had this little tower of material remaining, and it was too small to use the Forstner bit, but one quick knock with a chisel and the tower was down. Well, that was a lot of cutting, and it was pretty easy, but I think the headline here is, holy cow, what a mess. I have made a disaster area of my shop. So now that I've shown you how to hog all that out this way, I'm going to take the other two blanks over to the CNC and knock them out there because I think that's going to be a lot more efficient and hopefully cleaner. So just like the first bowl, the primary tool of choice here is a router. This one just happens to be connected to a computer and a gantry. And really it takes almost no design skill here to create a couple of circles and tell the machine to cut to a specific depth. The learning curve here is not steep at all. And that, coupled with the consistent speed and power of the CNC, makes this process way more efficient for this task. And I don't feel like there's any craftsmanship lost here because the real art in this process is selecting and arranging the boards to create the best look and most creative patterns. The CNC is just doing the repetitive grunt work, and it's doing it a lot more efficiently, which is great if you have lots of bowls to make. And while it's more efficient, I could definitely say it's not any cleaner. I guess no matter what method you use, expect to make a very large mess anytime you hog out a bunch of wood from the middle of a bowl blank. And now I can free my bowl from the blank by removing all the waste around the edges at the bandsaw. After I knocked off those corners, I went back around again just to get as close as I could to the side of the bowl. And then there's two ways that I can think of to deal with the little bit of material that's left over. The first is to use an edge sander like this. Just keep turning the bowl using consistent pressure over and over until the outside of the bowl is fully making contact with the sander. The other way I know to do this is to use a flush trim bit in my palm router, and this is exactly what this tool was designed for. Well, now I have a thing that finally resembles a bowl-like shape, but all the edges inside and out need some curves, and I'm going to start dealing with this on the inside. So have you ever seen those clear acrylic router jigs? Well, I need to make something similar to that, but just way oversized. So I copied the hole pattern from my circle cutting jig so that I could attach my router and then drill the countersunk holes for the screws. But I did have to switch over to using my drill guide to get the larger center hole because the acrylic sheet was just too big for the drill press to reach. Next, I need to add a router collet extender, and this is going to give me the ability to plunge all the way down into the bottom of the bowls. And then on top of that, I'm using a bowl and tray bit to flatten the bottom of the bowls and add a curve to the inside edge. And the most important thing to watch out for here is making sure that the bearing on your bit is larger than the diameter of the collet extender. Otherwise, you're not going to be cutting anything and you're going to wreak havoc on the inside of your bowl. Using an acrylic sheet like this is great because it keeps my router at a consistent height as I clean up all this waste, but I can also see into the bowl to check out what areas I still need to go over with the bit. And finally, and this is definitely not lost on me, it contains all the mess and traps it inside the bowl. And that just gives me a chance to stop midway, vacuum out all the chips, and then continue on my way. I think this is probably my favorite part of the project so far. And compared to the inside, the outside edges are much easier to deal with. A router with a roundover bit is all you need. I'm using mine in my router table, but a palm router will work here too. It's just a little harder to balance on the top edge of the bowl now that there's no material around to support the router. And now I just need to sand these up, and getting the bottom of the bowls as well as the outside is pretty easy just with a normal sander like this. But that inside edge is a little tricky. I found two different ways that work well for me. The first is this little detail sander that Milwaukee makes. I found this to be my favorite way to do it because it's got enough power to sand this down quickly. But an alternative is this little bowl sanding attachment for your drill. It just chucks into the drill and then you can put a little sandpaper on the end and it's soft so it can really get into all those corners really well. This method isn't quite as aggressive, so it does take longer to sand out all the mill marks, but it gets the job done. And to finish these bowls off, I'm going to use one of my favorite finishes for kitchen items. It's called Tried and True, and it's a mix of linseed oil and beeswax. It really does bring out all the colors so vividly, and that walnut is such a deep brown. And it smells so good. And it's really easy to apply, just like using board butter on a cutting board. Just wipe it in with a cloth or a pad like this, and then let it sit to soak in for about an hour and wipe off the excess. Well, these things turned out amazing. Also, who else is up for some chips and dip? So cornhole is one of my favorite outdoor activities all summer and fall long, but when the winter gets here and the temperature and the snow start to fall, you can't really bring that fun indoors. Unless... Hold on. For this project, I'm going to be using a couple pieces of 1x6 pine boards left over from a trim project. I'm going to trim one of these pieces to 36 inches. I do want this thing to easily fit on a dining table or a coffee table if needed. And with the other piece, I'm going to cut that into 2 10-inch pieces, and I'm not throwing away any of the offcuts here because I need those in a minute. Actually, never mind. I'm going to use them right now, I guess. I'm setting my miter saw to 30 degrees, and then I'm going to cut a wedge off the end of one of the offcuts like this. And then I can just set my saw back to 90 degrees and cut a matching wedge. And I need a total of 4 wedges here. Now I'm going to take those 10-inch pieces that I cut earlier and mark for a hole 2 inches down from the top edge. Then with a 2-inch Forster bit, I'm just going to bore a hole straight through the board. And by the way, you don't need a drill press for this. You can do this just fine with a hand drill, but I already had my bit in the drill press, and honestly, I was just too lazy to switch it over. Now I just need to take these wedges and glue them together in pairs. CA glue with some activator works great for this. It dries instantly and there's no real need to use your wood glue and sit around waiting for that stuff to cure. And these little wedges are just going to support the cornhole boards from underneath. Oh, and at some point I set my miter saw to 60 degrees and cut a little bevel on the bottom side of these boards. I guess for whatever reason I just missed filming that part. Now to add a little round over to the inside of these holes, and all that's left to do is attach these mini cornhole boards to the baseboard. I'm using CA glue here again, but this time I'm just doing it so that I can get these positioned exactly where I want them, and then I'll secure them to the base with a screw into those support wedgie parts. And it's probably a good time to mention that before you do this step, if you or your kiddos want to decorate these boards with some paint or decals, it would be much easier before they're attached to the base. Well, all the cutting and assembly is now done, but I did think it would be fun to add a scoreboard to the middle, and there's something that I've never tried before, and that's printing an ink transfer onto the wood. I have an inkjet printer, and here's the process for that. Take a piece of sticker paper and then pull off the sticker part and throw that away, because what we want is the waxy backing paper. Now take that backing paper and put it into your printer and orient it so that it's going to print on the waxy side. I just went in and created a simple black and white picture of a scoreboard in Adobe Illustrator, and then I printed that out. Okay, so the main thing here is don't touch the ink because it is wet on this waxy paper, but I'm going to do my best to get it in the position where I want it, lay it down. I got the scraper, anything like that. Just don't move the paper once you lay it down. And, I mean, it's there. It's actually not awful. Don't listen to that guy. He is an imposter. That's in fact awful, and it's time to use the woodworking version of the undo button. Okay, let's try again. Don't move it. Don't move it. No. All right, sand it again. All right, let's try again. Right. And we'll go out. And that looks like hot. Well, I've learned something about myself, which is I am absolutely terrible at this. I cannot get a result that looks anywhere close to acceptable, so I'm going to switch tactics and go to my Bambu Labs P2S to help. With an upgraded 5-inch touchscreen, a new intuitive user interface, and enhanced LED lighting, the P2S represents the next generation of the popular P-Series printers. And the P2S is compatible with the AMS2 Pro, which makes multicolor printing like this much more efficient, but the addition of the drying function is a nice upgrade over the original AMS. And another nice update to the P2S is the quick swap nozzle, which makes changing your hot ends that much faster and easier. Well, I really didn't want to design a whole new scoreboard from scratch, but luckily all I had to do was take my Illustrator design and export that as a DXF file, which is a type of vector file. And from there I could drop my file into Fusion 360, which is a free 3D modeling software, and in about 5 minutes I turned my flat 2D vector file into a 3D model of my scoreboard design. And from here, all I have to do is save my model as an STL file and open it right up in Bambu Studio. I can then use the layer painting feature to add colors to the raised text and assign each color to multiple different filaments, and then send it off to my Bambu Labs P2S for printing. The prints that the P2S puts out are high quality and consistent. To go from a picture to a 3D part in almost no time, that is so cool. And to go with the scoreboard, I also created these little pegs so that each player can keep score. So even though I originally wanted to create this scoreboard using a completely different method with the ink transfer, when I couldn't quite pull that off, it was so easy to pivot and create something way cooler using the P2S. Every maker eventually hits a wall, but 3D printing is a great way to break through it. Before I add the scoreboard, I'm going to give my cornhole boards a few coats of spray lacquer. I'm using satin here because it's all I have on hand, but you may want to try something more glossy if you want your boards to be a little bit more slick and add some extra difficulty to the game. Then to add the scoreboard, I'm just going to glue it to the base. Well, that leaves just one thing to complete this game, and that's some mini cornhole bags and a way to toss them. After some searching, I did find this set of mini cornhole bags on Amazon. They work pretty good for their size, but my two gripes are that they only have this one color combination, so you only get red and blue. But more bothersome is the fact that these tiny little bags cost me $15 after tax. But this was the only option I could find to get bean bags this small. That is, until I checked Maker World and found a really interesting alternative. Some person way smarter than me came up with these little woven squares that act just like bean bags. Not only are they a good size and act kind of floppy like the real beanbags do, but they cost me just $1.04 in filament to print, and I can make them in any color that I want. Now, you could toss these with your hands, but I wanted to try two different options to add to the game. Option number one was to print out these flexible flippers on the PS2 and then add them to the bottom of the boards using screws. I wasn't entirely sure how well this was going to stand up to repeated use or whether these tabs were even going to work well at all. So as a backup, I printed these little rubber band powered catapults. Woo! Oh man. Well, that went across the shop. Well, there you go. All the fun of cornhole shrunk down into a mini size to use anytime you can't play outdoors. This next project is one that I saw in one of those viral woodworking compilation videos, and it looked so cool that I just had to try it.
What matters is, does it work?
That is a great question. I've never done the process of kerf bending wood before, and this looks like it takes that to an extreme, but I still want to give it a try. Okay, so in the video, it looks like they start out with a wooden blank that's about 12 inches square and a little over an inch thick. And thanks to the magic of editing, I happen to have one of those right here. The one thing I could not tell in the video is what the wood species was. It looked kind of oakish, so I've got a blank that's made out of oak and another one that's made out of walnut, and we'll see if either one of these does the trick. So to make these kerf cuts, it looks like I need to make something like a little box joint jig, which I went ahead and made off camera because this really, I think, deserves its own video on how to make one of these, and there's just no time to do it in this video. Then I just need to start cutting what looks like about one kerf every 1/4 of an inch, but I need to leave about a 1/16 of an inch at the top of each one of these kerfs. I don't want to cut all the way through. Then I'm supposed to flip the board end for end between each kerf and slide it down one, kind of like a snake winding back and forth. I sped this video up, but I really was trying to go slow and be as careful as I could here because there's not a lot of material connecting these strips, and if I broke it, it's game over and I'd have to start all over again. Interesting, it's already starting to get bendy. Now with all this side cut up, I need to rotate it 90 degrees and repeat that on the other side. Kind of like a grid of curves. Whoa, this is already feeling kind of wild in my hands. I think this might actually work out. Okay, next I need to drop this face down in what looked like some steaming water, I guess just to let this side soak in a bit, and then turn it over so that the wet side is facing up, and this should start to demonstrate the principles of wood movement because one side is wet and the other is not. So the oak definitely reacted. There's a nice arch there. The walnut has a small hump in the middle, but not nearly as much movement. And I'm supposed to just keep spraying that wet side with water, and it's supposed to keep bending upward. Now, in the video I saw, they cut out a small concave base for this thing to sit in to create the bowl shape. I thought it would be fun to mix materials here and make it a bit more interesting, so I designed a similar style base in Fusion and then printed it out in about an hour on the P2S. You just need to assemble the base by sliding this joint in the middle together like this. Then I can set that wet side of the piece down into the base and place a bit of heavy stuff in the middle there. I'm just using a stainless steel bowl filled with stuff to give it some weight. This should help the form take shape as the wood dries out. And it looks like everything is touching nicely. And after that, all I need to do is glue the bowl to the base, which locks everything into place. CA glue is perfect for this because it bonds well between the two different materials and it dries super fast. Well, there you go. I think these things turned out awesome, and they weren't really that hard to make at all. And I will say that even though the walnut did not arch up like the oak did when I put water on it, I think that's because it was a lot more pliable. because when I went to set them and conform them to the base, it took a lot less weight to get this one to sit in there than it did this one. About 35 pounds for the oak and only about 20 pounds on top of this walnut one to get it to sit in there. So there you go, kerf bending. Keeping with the theme of trying things that I've never done before, here's a good one. How do you carve sound into wood? Have you ever seen one of those art prints where they capture the sound waves and transfer that to a canvas? Yeah, I want to do that, but with wood and sharp objects. So my thinking was, in order to get some nice details in the sound waves, this piece needed to be long and narrow, and I decided on a final dimension of 8 inches wide and 36 inches long. How did I decide that that was the right dimensions, you ask? Well, because that's how long the maple board was that was sitting in my offcut bin. Yeah, it's not rocket science around here. So my first thought was that I would take this board and cover one side with black India ink and then carve the design into that so that the light maple would show through. Sounds great, right? But I reconsidered because I was a little afraid that there would be a lot of contrast but no depth to it. I wanted something that looked a bit more like a topographical map with different layers to the depth. So I decided instead to take this walnut board, which is really dark in color and also pretty clear grain, and then resaw that at the bandsaw. This could also give me the chance to use a nice book match effect, or at least that was my thinking. I really wasn't sure if that would even matter once I carved into all the material, but the board wasn't going to be wide enough anyways, so a glue up was going to be inevitable, which is what I did next, just using some wood glue and let that sit to dry. Once that was dry, I planed that down to about 1/4 inch thick panel that I could use as a veneer on top of this maple. And really, I don't need it to be 1/4 inch, but that's about as thin as you can go on a planer. So the best route is just to go ahead and veneer the maple, and then once that's dry, run that whole thing back through the planer until that veneer is just about 1/16 of an inch thick, which is between 1 and 2 millimeters. And how do I know that that's the right thickness to use? Well, honestly, I don't. I'm kind of in unknown territory here. So I kept the rest of that walnut that I resawed handy just in case I need to try this again if this goes sideways. And this is just how I figure out how to do stuff that I don't know. Learn what I can from other people, and then when that only gets me so far, I just lean into the unknown and be prepared to try more than once. Okay, well, that ends the part of this project that I know how to do. Now I need to go figure out how to put sound into wood. So in order to carve into wood, I need a vector file, but all I have is this basic MP3 music file, which I captured in my sound editing software, Adobe Audition. I just went in and clipped out the section of the song that I wanted to use and then saved that clip out to another MP3 file. So then I just Googled MP3 to vector image, and I'll go ahead and cut to the chase and say that most of these services charge a fee somewhere between $5 and $10 to do this conversion, but this website, convert.ing-now.com, was free to use. The downside to this site is that this isn't a vector file yet. This is just a picture, which I suspect is why this is a free service and not one of those paid sites. But I have Adobe Illustrator, and that has a feature called Image Trace that turns a picture into vectors, and so I really didn't need to rely on one of those paid services. Okay, now I have the all-important vector file that I can load into my CNC software to create the carving. And once I looked at the rendering, this looks like it might actually work, so I just sent it off to the CNC to give this a try. First, I started to carve out all the flat areas in the middle, and the first bit of good news that I got is that it indeed carved through the walnut and into the maple. Then I switched over to my carving bit to add all the details of the little individual peaks and valleys of the sound wave. This was an amazing process to watch unfold. The carving, it took a while, but when it sped up, it does look pretty cool to see. And I found that using a stiff bristle brush here was nice just to clear out all the chips created by the carving. They tended to just get stuck in between all the fine lines, and I'm not running the dust collection here because I really wanted to pay attention to every step of this process to know how it was going. And the end result, I have to say, is pretty dang cool looking. And I really don't know what I would change to even make it look different. Oh, by the way, I did carve some song lyrics into this to match that soundbite, and there's going to be a pop quiz at the end to see if you know the song. I thought about using the tried and true again, but it's so thick with all that wax, and I really didn't want to have to deal with trying to get all of that out of those little tiny sound waves. So I opted for a wiping varnish instead, and I'm going to apply this using a foam brush. I know that this finish is a lot thinner than that tried and true, and so I was hoping that would help me get into all these little details more easily. And a couple coats is all I really need here. This is just going to sit on a shelf and not really be touched, so you don't have to go crazy with layer after layer of varnish. Then I just created these little minimalistic support stands, one for each side, and printed them out on the P2S, and this thing turned out amazing. So nice. All right, quiz time. Can you guess where this soundbite is from? Go ahead and drop your answers down in the comments. All right, I'm going to throw in one more bonus project, and this one's really quick to do, and I'm going to make a couple for gifts anyway, so let's see how long it takes you to guess what I'm making. First, I'm going to need a small piece of scrap like this one, preferably in the 5" by 10" range and about 3/4 of an inch thick, but really there are no rules here, just use whatever you got. I'm using this figured maple. I think it's a good idea to use something a little flashy here because the piece is so small, just to give it some visual interest. I'm going to take that and mark for a hole about 2.5 inches up from the bottom edge, and then I'm going to drill a cavity using a 2" Forstner bit. And this is the non-show face, by the way, so if you have a favorite side of your workpiece, drill this on the opposite side of that. And I don't want to drill this all the way through. I want to leave a little bit of material in the bottom of the hole. And I really need to be careful here because these large Forstner bits have spurs in the center, and the larger the bit, the larger that spur is. I don't want this thing making its way through to the other side. And by the way, if I don't want to worry about this, there is another way to do this. It just takes a couple more steps. In this version, I'm just going to drill that hole all the way through the workpiece, just like that. Now I can laminate another thinner piece of wood on top. I'm just using some wood glue here, and this top piece is about 1/4 of an inch thick that was left over from that Soundwave project. And so when the glue dries, I can just clean up these edges and make everything nice and flush, and then just like on my Soundwave piece, I can run this through the planer until I get a really thin veneer left on top. Then I can take both pieces and add some 5-minute epoxy, just smearing it around all in the bottom of the hole, and then I can slide in a large magnet. And after about 5 minutes, I can clean up the front edges with my palm router and a roundover bit just to give it a nice finished feel, and then finish both sides with more of that tried and true. The oil is really going to make that curly maple pop and also give the walnut a deep brown color. I really like this stuff. It's so easy to apply, and I'm not worried about getting any of that finish on the magnet because it's just going to wipe right off that metal. Okay, I'm going to add 2 countersunk holes on both ends, and this is going to be for mounting screws, and then 2 pilot holes just underneath the top countersink. And I'm careful to make sure that I do not put these holes on the end with the magnet. And if you haven't figured out what I'm making yet, here's the dead giveaway. Each one of these screws into the pilot holes, and there you have it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this one. And cheers to trying new things and using up all those scraps. See you next time.